So can we have the first slide, please?
See it?
I do see the presentation, but it's you're into this presentation. You don't have slide 1 up.
All right.
There we go. All right. So the title of today's sermon is Controlling Ourselves. We often say that God is in control, and of course that's true. God is over everything, but we do also have to control ourselves. The spiritual life is a collaborative effort. God, His Spirit, and us, and of course other people involved, and all those things working together sometimes make life rather complicated. But bottom line, we have a lot of responsibility in controlling our own lives. Next slide. So this is kind of an unusual talk this morning, and it is not a lecture. It is not a lecture. If nobody says anything, this sermon will end very quickly. It was actually inspired by Roberta, an idea she had, which was to consider interesting quotes that we find in our outside reading, and then talking about them from a spiritual standpoint. So there is a book called Stalling for Time by a fellow named Gary Nosner, who was basically the hostage negotiator during the Waco events. Now, I don't know if you remember that very well. The Branch Davidians, David Koresh, and so on. There was a recent TV series called Waco, which you may have seen. Roberta watched it. I did not. I probably should have when she told me how good it was. But anyway, the series was based on this book called Stalling for Time. So how does that relate to self-control? Well, there was a wonderful quote in that book, which will be on the next slide, but don't go there yet. The key scripture, one of the two key scriptures for this talk is the one listed in yellow there. Like a city that is broken into and without walls is a man who has no control over his spirit. That's Proverbs 25, verse 28. That particular translation comes from the New American Standard Bible. So keep that in mind. A city that is broken into and without walls. That's what you're like when you don't have self-control. So you think about a city without walls. What should stay inside doesn't stay inside. What you don't want to come in comes in. And life becomes very complicated and usually unpleasant. You can go to the next slide. So the quotation that came out of this book is this one. The human race is challenged more than ever before to demonstrate our mastery, not over nature, but of ourselves. That quote came from a woman named Rachel Louise Carson. Now, I'd heard the name. I didn't know much about her, so I looked her up on the web. She was a writer, scientist, ecologist, a very bright and talented woman. Former editor-in-chief for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, she did that at a time when women really didn't do much. It wasn't their fault. That was our fault as guys. But anyway, she became a full-time writer about nature in the 1950s. And there was a book she wrote, which I also remember hearing about in school, and which I should probably read, but I haven't. It's called Silent Spring. And basically that book essentially spurred the beginning of the environmental movement, which was a grassroots movement, very much citizens were concerned, and it eventually led to the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So, very influential person, awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Carter, and so on. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. I thought you might like to know about her. The original context of the quote, of course, is that our power over nature through technology, is what she's really talking about, has advanced to the point that it poses danger to ourselves. And, I lived back then when they were discovering what some of uh, the different chemicals that we were spraying all over things were doing. They weren't, maybe they were helping the crops, but they were hurting us and they were hurting wildlife as well. But I'll end it there. That's not really what we're talking about this morning. For our conversation, consider this quotation just in and of itself, the one above there in yellow, from a broader spiritual context. So we can hurt ourselves if we don't master our own power, our power to make decisions, our power to speak, our power to do things. We can hurt ourselves and other people if we don't master those things that we have, that God has given us properly. Next slide. So this is where I would like lots of people to share their thoughts, because it's kind of a big question. What does it mean? Control ourselves. What does that imply?
One thing I think about when I see this is you should be slow to speak, slow to wrath, quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to wrath, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And just that's one huge aspect that I find people are quick to defend or to speak when and offend other people in anger, but we should have control over ourselves, being quick to listen and slow to speak and such. That's one thing that pops to my mind when I see this.
Yes, big, big, big point. Very important. Okay, so our speech, and also, like you mentioned, to control ourselves to listen. We have to focus. Excellent. Anybody else?
So Paul said, I buffet my body daily to make sure I behave appropriately, to make sure I'm submitting to Christ. So I think that's an area I think in controlling ourselves is that we have to be disciplined both in thought and in our actions, that we are letting truth and the righteous thought drive our actions, not allow our actions to clutter everything without a clear guide.
That's good. And I think, the phrase buffet my body, I don't think he was probably not physically bruising himself. I think the point is that there is a certain amount of self-denial that comes in. Denying temptation, thinking before we speak, engaging our mind before we start talking. Other thoughts?
Yes, I would like to say that patience is something that while we work on, we have to work on controlling ourselves, because when we lose our patience, we get very we get very unself-controlled, and I would say that forfeits a lot of peace. And there's a book called that Chris shared with me. I Kissed Jane Goodbye, something like that, and it talked about that the joy of intimacy is a reward of commitment, and that's the same thing with peace. That having that the patience and being able to have peace within yourself is a reward of just being patient and working on patience.
So how would you define patience? And not necessarily just
Well,
but somebody, anybody. including Carmen if you want.
Come on, Lord.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You opened it up.
So yes, so patience is when someone is like like asking you to do something and they want it right away, and then you try to say I needed time to be patient because I have trouble with patience myself. So
Yeah, what I was gonna say is that, when I think of patience, well, first of all, let me give you this. Well, when I think of patience, I think of what we're dealing with today during the coronavirus with traffic, and actually more so traffic and long lines and 6 feet apart, that could be difficult. But however, like there's something called road rage. If you beat the horn the wrong way, and I know some people who just don't have patience on the road.
So I think maybe a broad definition of patience, given the things you're describing, is it's an unwillingness to let things take as much time as they need to take. We want to rush the clock.
Mhm.
We want whatever we want, and we want it now. And there aren't really very many things we can have now that amount to much and that are worth having. And we don't like that. And I think too, the fear of death has a lot to do with it as well. I think sometimes in the back of our mind, especially me, now that I'm, retirement age, retired, I sometimes wonder, well, how many years do I have left? And, I find myself sometimes getting impatient with my projects. Well, or whatever I'm trying to do. Well, if it takes me a year to do this, well, goodness, I'll be almost 66. And young people, of course, have problems with patience for different reasons, but we all struggle with it.
I would say that I forgot what I was gonna say. I'm sorry. Maybe later I'll understand. Oh, what I was gonna say is we had a sister here in the church who talked to me about things while I was talking about some of my things that I was doing for God, and she said that whatever we missed out down here on earth will be repaid to you back up in heaven.
Yeah. So,
And that should help us with the patience that even if I do die and I live the righteous life, then everything will be okay. That's why it's important to live with Jesus.
okay. So we
Comment unless you need to move on. So as a mom with a large family, one of the comments I get when I'm out in public with some of my children, people say, "Oh, you must be so patient," when they learn that I have a lot of children. And I kind of laugh and say, well, patience is a matter of perspective. It's on the job training. But I do think that's part of the reason that God is so patient with us. He, besides that he's perfect, obviously, he can see the bigger picture. And even in my frail humanness, as I've grown as a parent over the years, there are things I'm more patient about with my young children now than I was when my first couple of children were little, because I can see the perspective. I can see the growth that's taking place and an action that, that they're doing now, that I know if I can help them, to shape that action, that it will grow into something useful. So patience is often taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture and realizing that things can work together toward good.
Absolutely. So far we've talked about controlling our speech and listening. Patience is a big part of self-control. A person who is impatient is probably struggling with lack of self-control. Any other aspects of controlling ourselves
Well,
you'd like to mention?
oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The quote you had in the very beginning about the city, that with the walls, somebody who doesn't have self-control is like a city without walls. I didn't really like that because I'm a fan of open cities. I want my city to be open so everybody can see. I want to be transparent. I want to be seen. I want to be open and not have walls and coop up and be in my little four walls and just dwell in there. But then on the other hand, you have the quote one slide before where it said that we want to control nature. And so I was thinking, if we want to often we want to control the outside because we don't want to control ourselves. Yeah, the human race is challenged more than ever before to demonstrate a mastery not over nature but ourselves. But so we want to control nature, we want to control other people, because sometimes, at least for me, it is often, if I get stressed, if I don't have control over myself, I start controlling others. And I think that will give me sanity. If I control everything else, then I will be fine again. And I think that is the wrong way. I have to start controlling myself and let God do the rest. And that then goes back to that picture again of the city. I have to be content and in peace and controlled and in sync with God within my city. So I myself have to have that and leave the rest to God.
That is a very, very shrewd philosophical point, I think, that you just made. And in a way, if I could rephrase it a little bit, in order to practice self-control, sometimes in some ways we have to give up control.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's absolutely true. I'd never thought of it that way before, but that's a very, very interesting point.
If you want to control something, you need a tool to control it, like a scale for a pound. And we need something where we can measure our self-control, and that might be God.
Yes, it's God. It's God. It's the Bible. It's wisdom, the Spirit. That's right. That's another excellent point. Well, how do we know if we're out of control? Well, there has to be some standard for it, right?
Yeah,
Yes, go ahead.
one of the things one of my skills is definitely looking back on the height which I have fallen, which is basically realizing that I'm not a perfect human being, that the only one who was perfect was Jesus and God. So that's why. So my scale is when I want to give up on someone that I love or someone that has hurt me. The Holy Spirit actually will bring it back to me and say, well, did I give up on you when you committed this sin? And that's usually convicts me to go back and say, okay, I received grace, so now I want to share the grace that God has given me and give God the praise with it, but by helping this individual, even though this person ain't listening or stuff like that.
Right. Forgive and be forgiven. They go together. So can we advance the slides?
I would like to add something.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Sorry.
To control ourselves, I think we also should control what we consume. What kind of spirit we consume? Is it the spirit of God or is it the spirit of the world? And what is in us will show how we can control ourselves.
Yes. Out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And of course, I think the point you're getting at is, well, what went into your heart? Very good. Very good.
I like what Cordelia said about walls that we put up with relationship with other people. That when you have a wall, you can't see each other. And we want to be open to as like an open Bible to answer any questions they may have about the Bible.
Right.
Self-control is one of the fruit of the Spirit.
Right. I think yeah. So the walls analogy, of course, Proverbs was written a long time ago, and it's, up to probably 500 years ago or less, many cities, especially in Europe, had walls. A few of them still do. And so, kind of need to keep that analogy in mind. The walls are self-control. But absolutely, you're right, John. And Cordelia was right too, and that, not all walls are good. When we lose our self-control, our walls fall down. But as you've pointed out, John, sometimes we end up erecting walls that shouldn't be there between us and other people. So there's different kinds of walls, right? The walls that I think we're talking about in that proverb are walls that should exist within ourselves.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that if I may.
Go ahead.
Self-control also means that we need the right kind of expressing of ourselves, because oftentimes, like an emotion like anger, if we Jesus said that if your brother offends you, you should go see your brother and tell him that, brother, you have offended me. And I think one of the big reasons for that is because if we are angry and we keep that anger in, then we get angrier and angrier and angrier. And then next thing you know, we're no longer controlling ourselves. The walls come tumbling down. Which is why I like Cordelia's I like Cordelia's point about how she said that she likes to be transparent. I agree with Cordelia that the walls can't always be caged in, that like a real wall, it should have a little gate to get out. And that the gate should be that if a brother sins against me or if something happens, I should be able to express that.
Right. So I think one of the things you're pointing out is that anger destroys the walls within us that should be there.
Yeah.
We end up saying things we shouldn't say. It also puts up walls that shouldn't be there.
Right.
We don't listen. So I don't know. The walls analogy is fun.
Jeff, in terms of the reason that the scripture says the walls being a necessary part, I think Teo hit the nail on the head with that particular area. We have to have protection. We can't just consume everything. We have to set up guard rails and things that protect what goes in our eyes, what goes in our heart, and that's the purpose of that wall, and that's never changed. It still is there. It may not look like a physical wall that has other negative ramifications, but we have to be careful, whether it be the media we take in, the friends we engage with. All of this is throughout scriptures, and that's, I think, what the wall is touching upon is preventing dangers from insidiously coming in and perverting and deteriorating the what's precious inside.
Sure. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I think we've talked about this a little bit, but maybe this is an opportunity to get a little bit more personal if you're willing. So what are some real life examples of times that you needed to control yourself? Maybe real situations or real challenges that you've had or have or are having.
The time I needed self-control is I guess when I was in custody. I'm actually well known for my good behavior, but when I was in DCF custody, things were hard because first of all I needed to wait for timing, and my timing never came because the judge ruled that I couldn't go home with my mother. But I just had to use self-control, even though that made me so upset and sad. I just had to bite the bullet and go through it.
Yeah. disappointment is very often a time when we need to control ourselves, need to control our thoughts. Sometimes when we're disappointed, we end up drawing a lot of conclusions that aren't real, and making things worse.
Yeah.
That's a good example. That's a very good example.
So I'll give it a couple examples here. Well, coming out of, I think what my dad was talking about last week in terms of that the heart is deceitful above all things, and that there's a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it is death. I mean, this nature of self-control where we aren't, the struggle between being clear on truth and driving our decisions that way versus letting our heart just drive us in thought out processes. I find myself, especially with advent of smartphones, I love to read. And you know how much time I can find myself having wasted reading a good book on my phone versus actually doing what would be better, doing the right thing, or whether it be sitting there trying to think through, trying to do the right thing, and then suddenly wanting to eat just to pass the time. And those are times where self-control really just, if I don't have a clear, very clear, alert mind that says, this is what God has given me, this is my time for him, this is the way I should be using my resources, this is what is right and wrong, suddenly all these little heartfelt things start to flood and cause me issues. So that's one example for me.
I mean, I can give an example for myself that's a little bit like that. You know, since I've been retired, my time is naturally much less structured. You know, there's much less built-in structure than there used to be. You know, and I'm the kind of person who loves to do a lot of things. And you know, the list of things that I want to do gets very long. And a consequence of that is that my mind is constantly going from one project to another. And, you know, I can be, you know, I mean, it can take me 3 hours, 2 hours. One time it took me 2 hours to clean the bathroom, because while I was cleaning the bathroom, I was also writing music and thinking about other things in my mind. But the problem was that I didn't actually write anything down, and I didn't actually drill any wood or do anything. It was just my mind flying around. And I find that, you know, I really have to work hard sometimes to focus on what I'm doing at the time, especially if it's something that is quite frankly sort of boring. But if I don't keep my mind in control, the boring job takes longer than it should. And then I look at the clock and I get mad at myself, which I shouldn't do either, because I've taken so much longer to do something trivial and taken time away from things that are either more important or that I'd rather be doing. I don't know if I'm alone in this struggle, but you know, Chris, what you're describing sounds maybe a little bit along those lines. Got to keep our focus on what we're doing.
I like that you have a mechanical mind. You like to fix things and try to take apart things and put them together. I used to be like that when I was a kid, like transistor radios and stuff. But your mind continually works to want to discover new things. Maybe do a puzzle or something that challenges your mind.
Yeah, we're kindred spirits there. We've talked about that before. I think at one point you were interested in small engine repair. So yeah, I can relate. I can relate.
So when I work on a car, I do it right, and then I forget where the screw goes, and I have no patience of looking back on the menu and see where everything goes. I have trouble with patience.
Yep. Challenging projects. They require us to control ourselves, that's for sure. I'm sure Chris can share about that with some of the challenges he has in his work projects and his home projects.
My self-control is weak if good food or sweets are around.
Yes, I'm sure many of us can relate to that, myself included. And that ties in with what Chris said earlier, which is something I struggle with, was that, I tend to have thought food as well. And yeah, got to be careful there. Got to be aware of what you're doing.
Jeff,
Yes.
I was going to second what Christiana just said, and note that I was reading a book over the Christmas holidays last year, written by Ben Franklin, about how he would focus on his vices, and he would write a list, a tracking list, kind of a self-monitoring list of goals of trying to tackle his vices. And so we use that technique in weight loss, where you're trying to track your food so that you can try to identify weak points and try to improve your healthy eating. But I found it interesting that he was doing that so many years ago for different types of vices and trying to counteract and control himself through kind of creating goals around that. I thought that was really interesting.
So the mind is one of the things that we're supposed to worship God with. I think that ties right in with what an awful lot of what people would say. Let's go to the next slide, please. So, we've talked a lot from our personal experiences and have really done very little with the Bible this morning, and I certainly want to correct that at this point. So, and there's a misprint here. People who succeeded in controlling themselves actually is what this should read. But there are biblical examples, good biblical examples of people who executed or who exemplified tremendous self-control. And I actually have a slide with a bunch of those collected, but so I do have them, some. But what are some biblical examples of good self-control that you can think of that you'd like to share?
One of them is when I start the project, I finish it.
It's very good. I'm looking for examples that are actually in the Bible.
I think biblical's of I think biblical thing with self-control is believe it or not, is Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac because that was kind of like it was a test, but it also showed he controlled his own emotions and put God first.
Great example.
David did not kill Saul.
Yeah, that was a good one too.
Another great example.
Daniel continuing to pray even when there's issues against him, having the self-control to do the right thing. And the first time, yeah, and also when Daniel first came to Babylon and actually didn't eat food, and other areas of self-control there.
Jesus and Stephen, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," instead of lashing out at them. And Stephen said, "Hold it not to their account," when he was being stoned.
That's right.
Jesus fed the Lord's Supper and was patient.
Yes, and he didn't lash out at Judas Iscariot, even though he knew what Judas was up to, but he didn't give himself away at all. None of the other apostles realized what was about to happen, because Jesus didn't do what I probably would have done, which is make it very clear that this guy is a bad guy.
And that's an example of a wall that Jesus had up because he probably didn't want the disciples to beat him up or something.
Well, yeah, that's a consideration. Yeah.
One of them is Meshach, and Abednego. They were controlled and chose to follow God instead of bowing down, even though the penalty was fierce. So
Yes, they overcame their fear. Their faith overcame their fear.
Another one along the lines of Daniel, when Nebuchadnezzar freaked out and was going to wipe out the entire all the astrologers and all the dream people, Daniel was very calm and thought through it and maintained self-control and dependence upon God in the midst of the craze, which would make most people run in fear.
Oh, that's a great example. In fact, I think the words were, at least I think the NIV translation says that he answered with wisdom and tact. Always a good thing to have when you're in a difficult situation like that. He ended up saving the lives of a lot of people that way.
Jeff, I got a perfect one.
Yeah.
I got a perfect one.
Yeah.
When Jesus was getting beaten up by the soldiers, he didn't call 10,000 angels to wipe them out.
Oh, that's a fantastic example.
And then the other one I thought of is it was Saul. No, not Saul. It was one of the kings. Solomon, who could have asked for anything of God the Father, and instead he asked for wisdom to rule his kingdom.
That's right. That's right. That's another one. But can we go on to the next slide? Because I want to do some counterexamples from the Bible too.
Sure.
So there are also plenty of examples in the Bible, famous examples of people who failed to control themselves. Can you think of some?
Jonah.
Well, one of the prophets that talked to, I think it was Jeroboam or Jeroboam's wife, was told to come straight back by God. And as he walked along the way, another prophet came up and said, "Hey, God told me to have you come by and eat with me." And he broke his self-control, broke the principle because of the situation. So that's another example of bad failure.
Yes.
Jesus flipped the money table when they was giving the money out to the in the church to what was it?
Even though the money changes.
He was flipping money changes.
Well, I don't think that Jesus lost control there. I think we can. Yeah, that's righteous anger.
That's the story that I heard.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to accuse Jesus Christ of losing self-control. No, that's not a good example. Sorry.
I would say Samson when Delilah, I think it was Delilah, had him cut his hair off, he lost self-control.
That's right. That's right. That's a good example.
Well, Samson's before that, what got him into trouble was complete lack of control.
Yeah.
David and Bathsheba is another very good example.
Yes, Bathsheba's a great example.
Lot's wife who looked back.
Yep. That's right.
he took gold from Jericho when he wasn't supposed to.
That's right.
When Adam and Eve took the apple when God said no.
That's right. Another example.
And then you have oh, I forgot the person. I'll come back to it.
I got one more. When Judas took the change instead of going to Jesus.
That's right.
Yeah, and then you have and then you have the person who the Hebrew writer talks about. I don't know if it was I don't know if this is the same one that Chris brought up, but the one who sold his salvation for for food. Oh,
That's Esau. Yeah, it's Jacob and Esau. He sold his birthright for a bowl of soup.
yeah.
That's right. Another good. So there are plenty of examples. I mean, if we want practical examples of the good and the bad side of self-control. There's probably no better book you can go to than the Bible. And we could probably talk about these things for a long time, but I don't want to take too long. So let's go to the next slide, please. So I think we probably have already covered this to some extent, but I think there was, I think Susan was the one who mentioned Ben Franklin and his method for dealing with his vices. So I guess what I'm looking for here is just some practical things that you have found help you to control yourself. And I think some of those things have been mentioned, but is there anything else that people would like to share? How do you manage this area of your life of self-control? So just some practical things that you've learned are helpful.
A couple of the practical ones I get from scriptures that really help me is, First Peter says to keep your mind alert, and then in Philippians 4 it describes to whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, whatever is true, noble, and right, excellent or praiseworthy. Think about these things, and the God of peace will be with you. And I think those are practical examples that keeping my mind focused on things that provide perspective and awareness of who I am and what I live for enable me to not get caught up in the distractions.
Sure. I mean, there are probably many good mental habits that we could mention, and that's, you mentioned two that are excellent. I mean, I'll share one from my own life, which is very sort of, I don't know, common. So when I was working, I always used to get up at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning. I had to. I didn't really have to. I mean, it saved a lot of time in traffic, quite frankly. And of course, I had to go to bed at a decent hour to do that. And of course, when I was retired, I mean, well, I don't really have to do that anymore. But I do, because I found out that if I don't continue that habit, that my body, for one thing, gets messed up. And I also don't get much done. I mean, I have been tempted, and occasionally I do give in to, staying up late and watching a movie that Roberta wouldn't enjoy. And there are quite a few of those because I like science fiction stuff and monster movies. But, I really have to kind of put a kibosh on that. And I actually still use a rather annoying alarm clock with a little tiny button on the back. I do not have a snooze alarm. That's helped me in my retirement.
Also, when you have no need to eat food, that takes a lot of self-control.
It does.
Jeff.
It does. I got another technique for that one, John. Not that I'm struggling. I'm not saying you're struggling with it, but I do. It really helps is to brush your teeth after you're done eating. I mean, if you worry about, getting cavities and things, and you brush your teeth after you eat, you'll be less tempted to keep eating. At least it helps me.
Jeff.
Other practical things?
Well, I think the first, one of the first steps is probably be true to yourself and admit your struggles or your shortcomings or and confess them to God in an honest way. And I think that leads to finding solutions, and maybe also, and that is something we don't talk about that much and practice that much, but also maybe confessing them. And this is a good way you did this morning, confessing them to each other and talking about them. I mean, confess sounds bad. Maybe it's just also just talking and be honest about it with each other to help each other and be helped.
Well, yes, and I thank you for saying that, because that's the sort of thing that I hope happens with sermons like this, is that we do learn from each other. And I have learned some things, and I hope you have too, from hearing what people have to say.
Oh. Just keep-
Jeff,
Yeah?
I had good self-control. Like when I went to work, used to go to work.
Yeah.
I used to show up early on my shifts.
That's a great example.
Yes, so one of the things I do to practice self-control with sleeping is because what I noticed is I have to control my thoughts at some level. So what I do is remember certain scripture, like the one that helps me the most is when Jesus said, "I have power both in heaven and on earth," and it gives me a sense of security. Because
Yeah.
sometimes uncontrollable actions could be a cause of insecurity.
Yes. Yes. And there's no doubt that having your mind out of control will interrupt your sleep. I know that from firsthand experience.
Yeah.
Probably many of us do.
Along the lines of what Cordelia was saying about naming something that you need to work on, either from a negative perspective, something you don't want to continue doing, or also from a positive perspective, something that a good character trait or biblical fruit that you want to see produced in your life. The Bible says to teach us to number our days so that we can gain a heart of wisdom. And I know that for me, I'm not a huge natural list maker, but when I do proactively look at those things that I want to change, either for the positive or to weed out of my life, and I make plans and a goal, it may not turn out exactly the way that I originally thought, but I make more progress than when I just don't name it at all and think, oh, I wish I was better at that.
Yeah. I know Chris in some of his teaching has used the word intentional a lot, that we need to be intentional in the way that we live and not just let life push us around. And I think that's a big part of it. And Paul does talk also about the need to assess ourselves spiritually, to have a sober estimate of ourselves, particularly in connection with the Lord's Supper, to, hey, before you do this, consider where you really are and what you owe to God and, where you need to be. That's an excellent point. Life, we should, to the extent that we can, make life happen rather than letting life just happen to us. But, I know there's a balance there, of course. So it's getting rather late, and I think I should end here. Could we go to the next slide, please? So this is the New International Version of this scripture, which I like a lot. For God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power, of love, and of self-discipline. And I think what we've been hearing this morning is we do have that power from God, but we have to take the initiative to use it. If we don't, we will end up failing in many respects. And, one of my favorite scriptures is the one that Heather pointed out, teach us to number our days. We will have regrets if we don't take advantage of the power that God has given us to discipline ourselves and grow. So really appreciated the comments this morning, and it was great. Thank you very much for making this a time when we can really talk with each other. Oh, and by the way, at the end of this, could you give me the next slide, please, just very quickly? So, I don't want to go over all these now, but if you're interested in these, I can send anybody these slides, and people added many others to these. These are just some that I picked out that might be helpful to you. So again, thanks and God bless.